Okay, we're going to get started. Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. I know we're all having good conversations, but
This is the cross silo. Yeah.
exactly. It's where everybody meets and greets. It's the great thing about interagency committees. Welcome everybody to this episode of the Strategic Growth Council. Brought to you. It's great to see everybody. Thank you for being here. And I am sad to say that it is Secretary Podesta's last Strategic Growth Council meeting, as she is moving on from her duties as secretary to be a member of the public once again. So we're so sad. We're so sorry. We're going to lose you. It's been great. I don't know if, Louise, you wanted to say any, deep thoughts about Secretary Podesta.
No, I think we just want to thank you for your leadership and all of the work that you've done. We will miss you and hope that you will come back and provide your insights and wisdom to us.
Speak all these years and I still have to ask how to work the mic. Well, thank you. This has been just an incredible opportunity, and the Strategic Growth Council is my favorite council or board meeting that I sit on because we're always just doing great things, hard but great, and it's nice to walk away and say, oh yeah, we granted millions of dollars today. So thank you for all of your hard work to the staff. I know you move a mountain every time we all come together, so thank you for that, and thanks for your leadership, Kate.
Absolutely. Well, we're all going to watch with envy as you actually spend time with your children and, have a life. So enjoy that. But come back and give us good ideas, because we want to keep hearing from you. With that, let's do the roll call.
Sure. Secretary Podesta.
Here.
Undersecretary Lester Moffat.
Here.
Deputy Secretary Pierre.
Here.
Assistant Secretary Olson Morgan.
Here.
Secretary Crowfoot.
Here.
Undersecretary Canove.
Here.
Director Gordon.
Here.
Cole Capritz.
Here.
And Mike Flad.
Here.
We have a quorum. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We are moving on to the approval of the minutes. I don't know if people have had a chance to look at them quickly, and then we can have a motion, I hope. I don't see the mic.
So moved. I would second.
Great. Do a roll call for those.
Secretary Podesta.
I'm going to abstain because I wasn't here for the meeting.
Undersecretary Lester Moffat. Deputy Secretary Pierre.
I'll also abstain since I was not here.
Assistant Secretary Olson Morgan.
Also abstaining, also absent for last meeting.
Secretary Crowfoot. Undersecretary Canove. Director Gordon.
Aye.
Nicole Capritz.
Abstain, wasn't here.
And Mike Flad.
We
Pass our
Great. I don't know what we would do if we didn't pass the minutes, actually. I don't know what happens if you don't pass the minutes. It's never happened to me in my entire experience of meetings. Thank you. I'm glad that was like a nail biter there for a minute. All right. Moving on to council member updates. As always, this is the moment where we talk about our what's happening at the agencies. It's a good opportunity to do some cross-agency and public education and engagement. So I don't know, anybody want to jump in? Wade?
I think I just got volunteered.
So we're very excited this week. Actually, tomorrow, the Ocean Protection Council, which is another multi-agency body focused on protecting our coast and our ocean resources, is coming together and considering and hopefully approving our strategic plan for the next 5 years. And we're calling it a strategy to protect California's coasts and oceans. So in that work, in that resource protection work, we'll no doubt, work to coordinate with the Strategic Growth Council, but very excited about that. And then I'll just say many of us are working hard under Kate's leadership on advancing our proposed climate budget to the legislature, which includes both proposals around how we spend greenhouse gas reduction funds, but as well the governor's proposal for a climate resilience general obligation bond to be considered by voters hopefully in November. That's actually an area of, it seems like, shared priority with the legislature. And then we've introduced a concept of a climate catalyst fund, which would be a new financial mechanism to help us meet some of our climate-related objectives and mandates. So I would say that the budget season's heating up with consequence to much of the work that we do at the council.
Great, thank you, Secretary Crowfoot. Other updates?
Yeah, so coming soon, we will be releasing our next round of our Healthy Soils grant application proposals, RFP. We have close to 25 million that we'll be putting out for RFPs this year. This is a huge bump thanks to the budget from last year. And we look forward to getting lots of requests for proposals and funding a lot of projects throughout the state on healthy soils, both direct farmer incentives and the demonstration projects. It's, as we sit here with a sustainable ag land conservation program item on the agenda, it's a nice synergy with the SALT program, our Healthy Soils program. So we always appreciate the partnership that we have with DOC on Healthy Soils and SALT, and look forward to that. One other thing I'll add that many of us here at this table are working on is the water resilience portfolio. We released a draft of the portfolio at the beginning of January. We received public comments and are reviewing those now. And it's been a really robust and I think really exciting discussion about what does the future look like for water management, water supply in California, and how are we all part of that picture. So certainly it's an exciting time for us here in the administration and in the state of California.
Great, thank you. That's been a huge effort. So thank you to everybody who's been engaged in it. Jana, did you have?
This has been a really exciting budget for the Health and Human Services Agency and departments. There's a lot of moving pieces. So given that we're already in February, I won't sort of highlight everything, but just a few sort of top line items that might be of interest to the group. There's a proposal for a new vaping tax to address the rapid increases in the rates of vaping among youth and young adults. And so the administration is putting forward a vaping tax proposal, $2 for every 40 milligrams, which will bring a lot of like e-cigarettes sort of more into parity with traditional cigarettes, which is great. We also have CalAIM, which is, Medi-Cal Healthier California for All. We're renaming. At the highest level, yeah, as everybody does. Including the governor. But at the highest level, CalAIM, Medi-Cal Healthier California for All, is essentially a multi-year initiative to improve the Medi-Cal delivery payment system, as well as the programmatic elements of delivery. So Department of Healthcare Services has run a pretty intensive stakeholder engagement process. That's actually wrapping up this week. They'll then move to incorporating feedback, and the final waiver should be available by May, possibly late April. Don't hold me to that. And then there will be several conversations that we'll sort of follow up on outside of the waiver process as well. So if you're sort of tracking that, that's the update. Master Plan on Aging, which has a lot of sort of cross-cutting areas, is proceeding apace. We have the long-term subcommittee submitting its stakeholder report in March. So that is not an administration document, but it should be a really interesting preview. And we're continuing to sort of meet cross-agency on that. And then lastly, coronavirus, which you might have seen in the news, is taking a lot of bandwidth, but our healthcare officials and agency leadership is working very closely with CDPH leadership at the federal level, as well as local and governmental level. The risk to California individuals is still very low, but we are doing a lot of organizational work to mitigate the spread of the virus. So if you have any interest, I won't speak to it today because I'll get the details wrong. But CDPH and CDC both have really useful websites with a lot of data. And that's the last of my updates unless.
Great, did you want to say anything about the work that you all are doing around mental health and homelessness, since that's such a big priority for the governor and it's related to a lot of the housing issues that we're
Yeah, absolutely. So in broad strokes, we're looking at the sort of 10,000 foot level, we're doing a concerted effort to really integrate behavioral health services and the medical delivery system. And so to better sort of integrate those mental health and physical health services, we're also doing work to better understand the main drivers of homelessness. So we, of course, are taking a little bit more of that health and human services lens on it, figuring out what is sort of the initiating cause of people ending up on the street. Is that a mental health diagnosis? Is that a lack of access to care? Is that a catastrophic health event in their family? So better understanding that, and then better integrating the wraparound services to then move from that understanding to action and getting them off the streets. We were very, I'll delay my comments on the priorities for SGC until later on the agenda, but I think there's a lot of really exciting opportunity for crossover work coming up. That's great. Yeah.
Alexis, you want to weigh in on housing since we're on housing?
Yeah, well, not a lot of new things in the budget related to housing, but we're really in implementation mode. Over the last couple of years, the legislature has passed significant legislation that will make an impact on our housing supply and production lines. So housing and community development is in an implementation mode on those pieces now. On the homelessness side, the one new thing that the governor announced in his State of the State speech is that we are about to put on an RFP for a data system, which will really help us understand not just sort of who the population is, but also have a better understanding of their needs. This is something that we've seen a number of other states adopt, and California is fairly late to the game on this, so we were excited that the governor was supportive of the idea. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a lot going on this space. Yeah, Kristen.
So I just have one update aside from the ongoing work that we're doing with many of you on the climate budget and also the water resilience portfolio. Cali PA is now accepting applications for environmental justice small grants. There's $1 million available in this funding cycle, which will go to support environmental justice related projects across California. Community-based organizations and federally recognized tribal governments are eligible for this funding. The funding will be prioritized based on the ability to promote community resilience and contribute to lots of things that we work on as priorities here, improving access to safe and clean drinking water, mitigating and responding and adapting to climate change, promoting pollution prevention and resource conservation, all good things that we continually work on together on these things, including reducing exposure to toxic pesticides and other chemicals, and building community capacity, and strengthening collaborations with schools and local governments. So the deadline to apply is Friday, April 17th, and Cali PA plans to announce grant awards in June of this year.
Great. Is there somewhere that folks can go to, we can point people for that, more on that program?
Yeah, the Cali PA website.
Okay.
Yep.
And it just strikes me, listening to you, that the regional climate coordinators, which is the SB 1072 program that we run through Strategic Growth Council, there's a lot of potential intersections just because that's all very community-led climate, but climate plus climate and other co-benefits / co risks. So it's something that we should think about sort of how to integrate. That's really a Louise question and Jesse, but how to integrate the work that they're doing with these folks, because that seems like a great crossover.
Yeah, we've had some really good conversations with Cali PA about that as we've been thinking through program development. So continue to figure out how to leverage the two programs and you have them complement one another.
And that's something I know we've all talked about a lot, but just this whole question of sort of people on the ground adding capacity and trying to be coordinated about the capacity and make it as big as possible, because that's such a gap everywhere in the state. Anybody else want to weigh in? Yeah, Nicole.
I'd just like to weigh in on a little bit about what's happening in the San Diego region, because again, it's just kind of what's going on with housing and transportation at the local level. So I think it's no surprise, and it's been going on, but we have continued to struggle with a push for a lot of sprawl projects that are a huge threat to the state achieving its greenhouse gas emission goals. And I'm happy to report that almost every single project, our county has approved 18 sprawl projects outside of their general plan. There are now 18 lawsuits against those projects, and a few of them have now been at least gone through the district court and have been stopped. And one of the core rationales of the court has been the inability to reach the state's greenhouse gas emission laws. So we're very happy about that. We also have a ballot measure so that the county would no longer, that'll be voted on next week, that if it passes, the county will no longer be able to pass sprawl projects unless there's a vote of the people, which was really brought forward only because the county was just derelict in their duty to adhere to the general plan and their general plan as well as smart growth principles, and they just didn't seem to care about the state's climate law. But so I think hopefully there's some precedent being set about how development is going to move forward. I will point out, and I know I've said this before, but I feel like, hey, it's a platform, why not just continue to say it, that what we are seeing, however, is in sort of long-term planning documents, either general plans or housing plans or transportation plans that are going past 2030. There is no climate law past 2030. Our climate law ends at 2030. We have an executive order, and that's great, but that does not apply to local governments. And so I continue to elevate the idea that we need to codify the executive order, which I know is not the responsibility of anybody on this panel. I'm just raising it because you all are in this Sacramento world where I think there needs to be a discussion, because cities are now rebuffing our calls for them to plan past 2030 because they, quote, don't have to. And there's no leverage we have to make them, other than, of course, political will and, hey, this is what the public wants you to do. But the legal leverage is really important, as we're seeing, like I just described, in the county with their sprawl projects. And so I really just, want to continue to put that out there. We have been talking to legislators, but it just feels like no one's really aware of it. So it's directly related to CEQA. I guess I probably don't need to say that. It's all about CEQA analysis of all of these planning documents. But we're seeing a lot of new long-term plans being put forward, and yeah, we're not planning past 2030. So that sort of segues into transportation. I think everyone knows in San Diego, we have an incredible new executive director, came from LA, but for us, it was transformative to have someone come down who really has put forward a world-class transit vision for San Diego. And all he talks about, so it's sort of the opposite of some of our other institutions, is the climate law, and that he has a responsibility to meet SB 375. And but nonetheless, they're about to go through their big regional transportation plan. And, so we're going to be pushing him to go, to use the executive order as a guidepost. But we have a pretty staunch group of elected officials who do not want him to. So I just, again, I'm saying all of this is sort of coming to a head. And I think we're going to win, but at the end of the day, it's still a struggle. But I just want to kind of give you a sense of what's going on the ground. And my final comment would just be on the governor's budget. Thank you for everything everyone has done. The omission I just want to highlight is TCC. And I think it's a program that a lot of us are really passionate about and inspired by. And so I'd just like at some point an update about what's going on with TCC and if there's anything we can do to sort of, bring some money back into TCC. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great update. And just really briefly wanted to say that I was honored to go down and speak to the joint board of Sandag, also with Jennifer Gress from CARB and with Ellen Greenberg from Caltrans, all of us kind of emphasizing the whole climate, they're not just climate goals, they're climate laws, and emphasizing all the co-benefits of doing strategic growth and what the health benefits are, what the land benefits are. And so it was I think a really good meeting. And we're just like, whatever we can do to help.
Thank you. I meant to thank you. Sorry, that was in my head of a list of things just to highlight. My team was there, my staff, and they were like, "Who is that Kate lady? She's great." And so, yeah, you give really powerful presentation. I think more importantly, something else I've said previously is that the more you all come down and speak to our local elected officials, because there's a huge disconnect between the conversations up here and conversations at the local level. So I know our executive director of Sandag did bring you down intentionally as a way to sort of, hey guys, because they're trying to, not to mince words, they're trying to get them out. So there's a certain cadre of elected officials who would like Hassan not to be there anymore. So the idea being, the more they're hearing hey, this is not one guy acting alone, going rogue, this is actually somebody who's trying to implement the state priorities and the governor's priorities. So anyhow, thank you. It was amazing and it had an impact. So again, I say that to say that everyone should keep coming down. And of course, talking to the community, but also really, I cannot emphasize enough, talking to local elected officials makes a difference because they don't know. And so you have a lot to offer them in terms of insight and information. Thanks.
Thank you. It's exciting what's happening down there. Alyssa.
Thanks. I just wanted to follow up on some of those great comments about stakeholder engagement from the transportation focus and give everyone a heads up to be looking out for some further stakeholder engagement on the Climate EO 1919. We'll be kicking off some engagement to develop an action plan for implementation for the transportation components of the EO in the coming week or so. And look forward to having more of those discussions, both hosted in larger settings as well as more individual and in the communities in the regions. The other heads up is for coming year attractions on SB 743 implementation. Caltrans is about to release guidance on how to implement VMT for transportation projects in the coming weeks on that as well. And so those will be coming out in draft and encourage everyone to take a look and share any comments. So thank you.
Thank you. And that's another area where I know a lot of people here, you or your departments have been super involved in that. So that's a really, and 743, for those who don't follow all the numbers, it takes me a while too on those, is the vehicle miles traveled. Essentially allows the vehicle miles traveled analysis in CEQA on specific projects, and the Caltrans projects are a major source of those projects. So it's a very big deal, and really glad that that's moving forward. Mike, did you want to weigh in on that? Great. I'll just add a little bit to what was said, and thank you, everybody. I think just on the OPR side, wanted to say really quickly a couple of things from our research side, which is really where we look at sort of long-term research in the state. Our Precision Medicine Institute that's run out of OPR just put an advisory board in place of folks from across the state, which is really exciting, kind of from the medical profession, but also community health folks. And really, we're sort of creating a structure within precision medicine, which is new for that group. And there's a big overlap actually with the social determinants of health work that's happening on homelessness and mental health with that group. So that's exciting. And then our learning lab, which does online learning in higher ed, just put out a number of seed grants for really innovations in curriculum to make science, in particular in math and computer science and other STEM areas, much more accessible to more people across the California system, and that they just put out $600,000 seed grants. So they're doing lots of very cool work as well. On the climate budget, just wanted to echo what others have said and really kind of nod to this group. The folks who have been the main agencies on that climate budget are mostly here at this table and have been working for months and months and months and months to broaden the climate budget beyond the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is really just clearly not enough and not designed to be enough to meet all of our climate goals and challenges, our climate laws, sorry. I keep trying to switch that, climate commitments and challenges. And so, as Wade said, really looked to move beyond GGRF, which is I'll talk about in a second, but which is the fund created by the revenues from our cap and trade system, to include both their climate resilience bond, really to invest in priority natural infrastructure, but also some gray infrastructure solutions to reduce risks from very specific things: wildfire, sea level rise, extreme heat, flood, and drought across the state. Big commitment to resilience in general in the budget. And then this catalyst fund, essentially to say, look, we all know that to meet our actual goals on climate change here in the state and in the world, most of that's not going to come from government grants. Most of that's actually going to be private sector engagement. It's just too much money. I mean, one number, it will take us between $8 and $17 billion of EV infrastructure to meet our 5 million EV goal here in the state. That's not something the state is going to pay for in its entirety, but there's ways that we as a state can use our resources to leverage private money by lowering interest rates, by de-risking projects, by doing loan guarantees, and we're really looking at that. So it's exciting. Altogether, $12.5 billion climate budget. And that doesn't include things like what Alyssa was talking about, the transportation system, discretionary money, sort of refocus on some of these areas, for instance, and everything that happens at CARB and the Energy Commission that isn't in that budget because it's ongoing. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, it was about $400 million less this year than last year for discretionary money, and that's for a variety of reasons. There was a surplus last year. There also were legislative priorities that got enacted last year, which diverted about almost $300 million in that fund, and that was really, really challenging. And the negotiation across all the agencies was really challenging. And I think that, absolutely one of the biggest issues coming out of it was the TCC did not make that initial cut, but just wanted to say I think we're all on the administration side really committed to trying to figure that out. And also this is, as it always is, the beginning, not the end of a negotiation. So, but it's always helpful to hear in stories of how these programs work on the ground from people who are not here. So any stakeholder engagement you can do is always really helpful. So that's the last thing I'll say on that.
Can I add, I don't know if this is the right time, but just given that we are the home of TCC and obviously have great stories and believe in it, is there a way for us to allow Louise to engage in those negotiations? Or, obviously I don't know the mechanics at all, but is there a way for us to give guidance or support, or I don't know, I'm just free flowing.
Yeah, Louise is in all these negotiations, so that's one thing, but yes, I think the guidance would be great.
Yeah, I think that's great. And we actually, before the budget, and I'll mention also some other things, we've been doing a lot of active outreach around TCC because we did find it's a program that people were not as familiar with. And so we have been doing a lot of really active outreach, which has been very, very helpful. And that started actually in the fall. And so we continue those conversations and working on different pathways to continue the program, because it has been, we're seeing results from the round one grants, which have been, executed and running for about a year now. And we're already seeing really exciting things come out of them. So we're very committed to finding a path to continue the program. And we also have a lot of planning grantees who are eagerly looking ahead to try to apply for implementation grants. And then I'll talk about our round 3 grants are closing next week or later this week. And we have communities lining up there as well. So it's great. We have a lot of interest and results, I think, so.
Yeah, and including 2 in San Diego that we're finally going to be applying. And obviously, the Senate Pro Tem is from San Diego, so there's a good nexus there. And so, do you need anything else? I just don't know. Is there anything else from us?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, other than money. Sorry. I meant more like
You mean, I think Nicole means
direction or
she and I need to
support.
go rogue because we're not formally part of the administration. So
That's great.
No, I think
And then there's the workshop coming up.
Yeah, the commitment of the council is incredibly helpful. And I think just, folks who are familiar with the program and are able to talk about what's happening in communities on the ground. I know got a little competition here on the dais. We've got Southgate also doing a little work. So, but I think it's really important to hear, and I will mention we're having an event next month because the strongest and most powerful voices are the voices of the communities that are doing this work. And so we're pulling together an event in March that will bring together grantees to share that information with one another and with folks here in Sacramento, which we're really excited about. But I think the more people can talk about what does this look like on the ground and what does it mean for communities to be able to do this kind of investment, which is integrated, it's transformational, it supports some of these activities are very challenging to fund in other ways around community engagement and anti-displacement that are so important for how we bring communities, real change that's meaningful and valuable to residents. So the more that folks are able to share that, and we're doing our very best. And so I think from you guys, getting that support is really valuable.
Thanks, Nicole. It's a really important issue. The last thing I wanted to say about the budget, and it's a good entry into the next item, which is the executive director's report, is one of the things you'll notice in it is I think, a recognition of the value of SGC as a place where multi-agency, multi-issue integration of policy is happening. So both the first of all, in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, there is a new proposed line which would really be focused on research and community engagement, which would be an SGC, OPR, also CEC, and resources run set of projects, including the fifth climate assessment, going much beyond that to resilience coordinators and the regional climate coordinators and others. In the bond, SGC is in as a strategic kind of overview of how the bond funding is going out and how it relates to climate resilience. So that really important piece of sort of how do we ensure that these are actually resilient projects. And then in the fund, the Catalyst Fund also has SGC at a strategic level, looking at sort of what are the broad categories where we really see an intersection between need on the climate side and demonstrated need on the capital markets. So SGC really as that existing place for an integrated approach on the strategic issues on climate, which I think is a real recognition of the value of this group and all of you. So thank you for that. And with that, I will turn it over to Louise for her report.
Great, thanks. I'm going to ask this maybe as a point. I'm wondering if it would be, are we allowed to switch the order of things on the agenda? Shouldn't. Okay, we'll continue. I separated these two items, and perhaps I shouldn't have. So, we'll go with it. It's okay. Okay. So I'll do a quick. Okay, I'll do a quick update on our program and activities. We'll then do the SALC item, and then we'll come in to talk about looking ahead to the year. So I'll do quickly just some our sort of typical organizational updates. And then I wanted to just put out there a little bit of the calendar for this year at a very high level, because I think it's helpful for thinking about how we want to utilize the council in it, and especially the collaborative function of the council. So on staffing, we've had a lot of new additions, which is very exciting. Within the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program, Judith Hinn and Shep Wilbon joined us there. They can wave, which is actually one additional staff in that program. So we're really excited to have some additional capacity within that work, which will help a lot with as we think about alignment and the role of AHSC within the broader housing initiatives. On our executive team, Fabiha Zaman joined us, and she took Ulysses' role, and so she's who will be handling all of our council meeting materials and working with everyone on scheduling and doing minutes and all of that great work. So we're very excited to have her, and she was an intern with us before, so great to have her back. We're also very excited to be hosting one of the first executive branch CCST Science Fellows. That's the California Council on Science and Technology. They've been doing a legislative fellowship program, placing PhD scientists in legislative offices for many years, and then this year opened it up to the executive branch. And so we're very excited to be hosting one at SGC. Christina Echeverria, who
It's not here. I have to interrupt to say that Louise also just won a Science in Government Leadership Award from the CCST, so really proud of her for that.
Thanks. Thank you. So it's a really great program, and they are placing PhD scientists, as I said, to look at roles in public service. So Christina is helping with the research program, but in a lot of other efforts around SGC. And OPR also is hosting a science fellow this year within the precision medicine program. So it's really great. And then we also have actually finally, we're partnering with the Tahoe Conservancy to help support some of their work on the Tahoe Livable Communities program. And so thinking about how, the Tahoe Livable Communities program is really focusing on the region and how to think holistically about meeting sustainability and climate and housing goals in that region. And so Patrick Wright, their executive director, had approached us a while ago about sort of collaborating on some of their work with their staff. And so Jessica Wackenhut recently joined as the program manager for that program at the Tahoe Conservancy. So she's not an SGC employee, but will be working with us and collaborating in a lot of ways, and with the Resources Agency as well, and HCD, as we really look at some of the issues on a regional scale. So that's really exciting and a new model for thinking about how to do collaborative work across state agencies. And then finally, we're doing some hiring, but as I said this morning, this is it. No one else is leaving. So we're going to stay the same, but we are adding 3 additional roles in the Health and All Policy team from last year's budget. And then we are backfilling one of our Transformative Climate Communities positions. So all of that is coming soon. So I'll give you a quick program updates because we're at a pretty exciting time. We've just had a number of deadlines or have them coming up across most of our funding programs. So in the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program, round 5 applications were due on February 11th. We have about $550 million available to award. We received 49 applications from 12 MPOs and 1 non-MPO region. What is really exciting in this year and has been a goal of the program for a number of years is we received our first tribal housing project application under AHSC. And staff has done a tremendous amount of work, both at SGC and HCD, to make the program work for tribes, and including a lot of technical assistance and outreach. And if you'll recall in the guidelines, we committed to funding a tribal housing project. And so that was a big step as well. And so we did receive our first application in this round. These project requests are over $1 billion. So obviously the program remains oversubscribed. But really strong projects coming in, and we will continue to work with HCD and others on how to really look at how we deal with that pipeline of projects and how they can work across the programs. And we'll make awards recommendations to the council in June. In the climate change research program, we just also had round 3 proposals due. We have $4.75 million available and had 37 applications requesting over $27 million in funding. So a lot of work to be done there, but showing just, I think there's tremendous demand and need for investment in action-oriented climate research. And so we will be going through a 2-phase review process of technical review and then really looking at how these relate to advancing the state's policy goals. We anticipate recommending about 5 to 7 awards again in the June meeting. I also mentioned at our December meeting our partnership with the Thriving Earth Exchange, which pairs science and science fellows with communities to tackle community-identified challenges. So we've just concluded recruitment for both communities and fellows, and working with the American Geophysical Union's Thriving Earth Exchange staff to move those projects forward, and those will all be launching later this spring. TCC, round 3 application period closes at the end of this week. We are anticipating 4 implementation grant applications again this year, anticipate to recommend 2 awards. We've seen also a significant increase in interest in the planning grant program, so we're anticipating making 3 planning grant awards, but have seen a large number of communities interested, and I think that's due in part to them seeing what other communities are doing, as well as a lot of outreach first from staff, and just the need for planning dollars that communities experience. I mentioned briefly, but on March 17th, we're having a convening here in Sacramento, as I said, to bring together TCC grantees, both planning and implementation grantees, to share their experience on implementation and the work that they've been doing. And so there's going to be presentations by the community leaders and the partners, and then also some elected leaders as well talking about the work. And so we will be extending invitations to everyone, but would encourage folks to stop by and hear. If they can't spend the whole afternoon with us, we will have a detailed agenda that we can share so folks can plug in and hear different elements of the presentation. We also just released the solicitation for the Proposition 84 grant program that we talked about late last year. These are grants that will be supporting wildfire recovery and resilience in communities that experienced wildfire between 2017 and 2019. Submission deadline is the middle of March, and we anticipate that we would bring this back to the council in April, these award recommendations. Finally, on health and all policies, up on the dais, you all have a copy of a letter that we received from the World Health Organization, and this is congratulating the Strategic Growth Council on 10 years of the health and all policies work. California has really been at the forefront of doing this work and implementing it across all of our state agencies. And so we received a congratulatory letter from Dr. Krug, who's the director of the Social Determinants of Health program at the World Health Organization. And this is just really exciting. We couldn't do all of this work without partners at the Department of Public Health, at the Public Health Institute. And as I mentioned, we're filling 3 additional positions, so the capacity of this team is growing, and the continued commitment and collaboration on achieving health and equity across all of our programs. And so we will be working over this coming year, in addition to thinking about our work plan generally, about how we leverage that additional capacity and staff to continue this work. The HIAP team, of course, has been leading on the racial equity work through GARE, which we're now calling the, and that was the Capital Cohort, now the Capital Collaborative on Race and Equity. And we have, for this coming year, we're going to have 2 cohorts. We're going to have a learning cohort. So these are agencies and departments who have not participated in the program before, going through the curriculum to develop racial equity action plans and learn together. We had an information session in December. Jesse Buendia joined leadership from the Department of Social Services and the Department of Corrections to talk about our experience with this work. And this is a tentative list of the departments that we anticipate will be participating in this learning cohort this year. And then we will also, on the second cohort will be an advanced implementation cohort. So these are the departments who have been participating 2 or 3 years in the racial equity work, who will be continuing to work together on the development and implementation of their racial equity action plans. And so really working together to advance that work. And so we're very excited to see the continued interest and commitment to the program, and excited to see more and more departments playing a role. And we have been having active conversations with CalHR and others on how this can support the governor's initiative, and specifically around California for All and the racial equity action work that's coming out of the governor's office as well. And these are very complementary goals. And this work provides an excellent way for departments to work together to start to advance this work. So finally, I just wanted to sort of map out where we're looking at this year as we go ahead. Today, we will spend some time talking about a work plan for the coming year and trying to make more space and opportunity for the council to work in a collaborative way to support administration policy priorities. And so as we look out, we've been mapping out our year and really trying to think about programmatic milestones and where they fall. And then how we can use that to then make more space for collaborative work with the council. So today we'll talk through the work plan after we hear about the SALC guidelines update. In April, we'll update you all on our racial equity work and also talk about the Prop 84 resilience awards. In June, we're going to have Award Palooza, we're calling it, where we anticipate that actually all of our programs will be coming with award recommendations. That's actually a really exciting opportunity to see, I think, the cumulative impact of our investments and how those are working together. In August, we will be rolling out the technical assistance guidelines that are required under Senate Bill 1072. This is something we've also been reaching out to many folks, many of your staff, to help support development of these guidelines. And so this is a requirement through this bill that we provide guidance to state agencies on how to support disadvantaged communities and undertake technical assistance. And it will lay some of the groundwork for the Regional Climate Collaborative's work. And then in October, we will do guidelines again for AHSC and TCC, and I put an asterisk dependent on funding. And then in December, we'll do SALC Round 6 awards. We will also, dependent on the budget, come back to talk through priorities for the next round of research grants and how that will fit in the broader research portfolio. And so that does leave a lot of space for us to think through how we can integrate some policy discussions and use the council meetings, both as a public venue, to advance some of our policy priority work. And so I just wanted to put that out there that we can then return to as we talk through the work plan for the year. So that's it.
Thank you. And I just wanted to remind folks that in your binder, there are longer updates from each of the programs that you can read. And also, I was supposed to say this before, but there are comment cards and materials in the back of the room for those who didn't get them. Sorry, Sandra, I know I was supposed to say that at the beginning and I totally forgot. So any questions for Louise on this portion of the executive director's report? Everyone's good? That was good. Thank you for that. All right, I think we're moving to SALC guidelines. This is, I think, the one. No, there's a couple of voting things on the agenda. This is the first of them.
Oh, hi. Good afternoon, Chair Gordon and members of the council. My name is Virginia Jameson, and I manage the climate and conservation programs at the Department of Conservation, and we administer the Sustainable Ag Lands Conservation Program on behalf of the SGC. Let me get this clicker. That's the wrong way. So today I'm here to tell you about our Round 6 guidelines and our proposals for those. So I'll go over just briefly the program background and goals, our recommendation, some details about the guidelines, and then our next steps. And so just to briefly start with the overview, as you may recall from December when I just was here to present to you, the principal goal of SALC is to keep farmland in agriculture and to further the purposes of AB 32 by supporting infill development and avoiding increases in greenhouse gases that are associated with the conversion of California's agricultural lands to other uses. As a reminder, it's a component of the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program. And the guidelines prioritize projects that protect lands most at risk from conversion to residential or urban development, promote ag sustainability, land use processes consistent with the goals of AHSC, and that provide multiple co-benefits. Up until now, the eligible project types have been agricultural conservation easements, which are easements that protect on a voluntary permanent basis agriculture for ag use into the future, and then also planning grants to local governments to implement plans for the protection of agricultural lands. There are some additional co-benefits that we like to remind you of. These include ensuring the availability of productive land for future food production, providing a buffer between communities in fire-prone areas, and protecting aquifer recharge areas, among others. The program also keeps land available for current and future carbon sequestration activities, as well as habitat and open space. To date, we've made $180 million in awards. 91% of those were easement grants and then 14 planning grants. And so far, we're in the process of protecting 112,000 acres. So the recommendation before you today is to adopt the draft Round 6 guidelines for the Sustainable Ag Lands Conservation Program. Just a brief overview of the process that we went through to be here today. We met with our SALC Interagency Committee several times over the course of the year to consider issues that have been brought to us through public comment multiple times since the inception of the program. And so we wanted to address these things as best we could. And so we held those committee meetings, drafted the guidelines, released those in December right after you made the last SALC awards. And then we held workshops in January here in Sacramento and in San Bernardino to try to increase our outreach to Southern California, and took public comments until January 27th, at which time we incorporated feedback back into the draft. So just to give you an overview of the changes, functionally, people could continue to apply to the program as they have been, but we've added a few tools and options that we hope will be helpful. The first is fee acquisition as an eligible project type on a pilot basis. We're going to test it out. Funding for optional management plans, a refinement of the program's risk options, a removal of minimum deed terms requirement that folks didn't like, a change to the points possible in the program's selection criteria, and finally the addition of councils of government, municipal planning organizations, and groundwater management agencies as eligible applicants. So the changes in the guidelines were basically driven by three ideas. First of all, the program is seeking to better leverage the resources that we have to tackle the state's climate change goals, and that includes bolstering the capacity of natural and working lands to sequester carbon and provide other environmental co-benefits. Secondly, we wanted to home in on projects closer to urban and suburban areas to better directly address the program's goal of supporting infill development and reducing vehicle miles traveled. And then finally, as I mentioned, providing additional tools for stakeholders to ramp up conservation. So with that, I'll get into a little bit of the meat of these. The first is fee title acquisition. So since the program's inception, stakeholders have requested that SALC funds might be used to purchase properties outright rather than to just purchase conservation easements. So figuring out how to do this has been tricky because buying the full interest in a property is typically much more expensive than buying an easement, and we don't want to reduce the number of acres that we're protecting by spending significantly more money per acre. So that said, there are some positive benefits that would come from allowing outright purchase. We would be able, land trust would be able to work with landowners who don't intend to keep farming themselves, so they're not necessarily interested in selling the easement. They'd rather offload the land entirely, and it would also accommodate the conservation of properties with easement values that are too low to be attractive to landowners. We do, on a regular basis, see easement values come in lower than the landowner would like to see. So we propose a pilot project type in which we would allow these fee title purchases, but that we would contribute the same amount of money that we essentially do for the purchase of the easement. In other words, we would contribute 75% of the appraised easement value, which is what we do for the easement grants. And so the applicant would have to have the hypothetical easement appraised, and then we would encumber the title of the property with conservation covenants so that it would stay in agriculture into the future. So we are proposing a 25% of the total pool of SALC to be available for this, or up to 3 projects, whichever amount is smaller. So that's that one. The second one is management plans. So another frequent request that staff got was that the program fund activities to increase carbon sequestration and enhance other co-benefits on protected lands. The guidelines propose funding the development of management plans in pursuit of those goals. So an applicant to either our easement or fee title acquisition portions of the program would indicate that they wanted to receive an additional $10,000 to develop a plan, and they would work with an expert who's done this work before. And then that plan would need to be updated every 10 years. So the next one is a refinement of our program risk options. As I mentioned, SALC is a sub-program of AHSC, and it has a statutory goal of protecting ag lands for the express purpose of encouraging infill development, and the language specifically targets lands that are at risk of urban and suburban sprawl. So just to explain the risk options a little bit, in order to evaluate risk to a particular property and to provide a metric for quantifying the greenhouse gas emissions and VMT avoided as a result of doing a project, SALC staff have worked with the Air Resources Board staff to develop a set of what are known as risk options. And so to be eligible for the program, you have to show that you meet one of these risk options. Which most typically involves measuring the distance of a property from a developed area. So for example, a project meeting a residential risk option would be within 2 miles of a city sphere of influence, or within 5 miles of a rural residential development, something like that, that helps us determine how many development rights would be created if a property was upzoned, and thus how many are extinguished as a result of us doing the project. So when the program was first created, there was a concern that a project might be at risk of conversion from factors that wouldn't result in upzoning, but that are still a risk. And so we created a set of options known as our current zoning options, risk options, that assessed those emissions avoided from doing projects in those areas. Those options looked at relative distance from highway interchanges, recreational centers, whether a property possessed a certificate of compliance or multiple certificates of compliance, which are county-issued certificates that recognize legal parcels with associated development rights. So as over the life of the program, we've seen only 5 projects out of 123 applications that we received apply under these current zoning options. And when they did, they were pretty far flung and would have avoided relatively few greenhouse gas emissions. So to better improve our messaging about what we're looking for in the program, and to encourage projects that avoid more conversion and increase the greenhouse gas reductions associated with the program, we recommend removing the current zoning risk options. Okay, next one's also a bit of a meaty one. So essentially, the draft guidelines had proposed requiring the use of a set of minimum deed terms, which I'll explain in a minute. But after hearing from stakeholders, they weren't interested in this, and so we removed this requirement from the draft. So some background on this issue. A conservation easement is a recorded document. It's a legal deed of conservation easement, which is binding on both the present and future owners of a property. The easement deed lays out terms such as the conservation purpose of the easement, and any restrictions that'll be on the property. The SALC program has always had an easement template with its required terms and conditions, as do many of our partners that provide match funding, like the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the Wildlife Conservation Board. And so making sure that everybody's required terms are met in the course of putting them all together, going back and forth with drafts, has always been a kind of time-intensive challenge. So in 2018, when the Department of Conservation conducted a land trust listening tour, one of the things that we heard was that stakeholders would really like to reduce the amount of time it takes to complete a project. And this is one of the places we thought we could do it. So we tried to be helpful by creating a set of minimum deed terms, which was an 8-page document that could have been either attached to another entity's deed, or incorporated verbatim. And the intention was to provide certainty about about terms. So land trust could discuss the requirements with a landowner and with an appraiser of the property up front, let them know exactly what would be required, and our staff would know what was in the document, and so thus it would reduce time. However, during the public comment period on the minimum deed terms, stakeholders expressed concern that the terms were too inflexible. And they have a whole variety of project types and landowner wishes they'd like to accommodate. And given this concern, we propose removing this requirement from the Round 6 guidelines and allowing stakeholders to utilize their traditional templates or ours, but still make minimum deed terms available for those who want to use them. So all that's
This
to
might
say,
literally
no
be the
change.
first time in state history where stakeholders wanted a longer version of the document that was more complicated, but
Yeah,
it's
we were
really
like, "Oh,
fascinating.
okay." Yeah. I mean, they had fair points. So the next one was changes to the selection criteria. So these are the points essentially that we award to. We have a set of projects that come in that are ready, they're eligible. So then how do we score them, rank them against each other to determine our funding priorities? And so in the past round, we noticed that we had a high number of points available for project attributes that weren't necessarily as pertinent to the agricultural uses of the property, that perhaps were disproportionately rewarding projects that didn't as well represent the goals of the SALC program. So for example, projects could be just as highly rewarded for environmental co-benefits as they could for proximity to urban areas, which is really what we're trying to go for in this program. So in response, staff increased the points available for project attributes that are associated with being proximal to urban areas and for ag uses and attributes, and added points for collaboration with tribes and farmer incubator programs, other aspects that we're trying to get at. And then finally, last big change to the program is the addition of eligible applicants to the planning grants program. As we've worked to bolster the planning grants side of the program over time, we've learned about the importance of ag planning for 3 additional entities. I mentioned those are councils of government, municipal planning organizations, and groundwater management agencies. And we also received comments over time to make these applicant types eligible. One of the basic requirements for participation in SALC and AHSC is that the project supports the implementation of a sustainable community strategy, or if one of those isn't available locally, then for a local transportation plan that supports greenhouse gas reductions and promotes infill. And given that COGS and MPOs are some of the responsible entities for those, we thought that we'd like to see them be eligible, and it makes sense. A lot of these plans, some of these plans touch on conservation of working lands, and we'd like to see more of them do that. So we propose adding them as applicants. And then in the case of groundwater management agencies, this is kind of a more recent stakeholder request, but it makes sense to us that SALT grants could be used to help lay out plans to maintain viable ag industries in the context of SGMA implementation. And lastly, just a couple administrative changes. The first one is that while SALC applicants are already required to notify local governments of acquisition projects in their area, we've heard from some local governments that they would also like to hear from us. We've met with some of them, and we're happy to do that. So we would reach out when we got an application and get any feedback that local government had. Secondly, the guidelines propose updating the definition of agriculture to explicitly allow for traditional Native American agricultural practices, so long as the project is led by or in partnership with a tribe. And then also we propose disallowing projects that are solely used for timber production. So before we return to the recommendation, just a touch on the next steps. Once you approve the guidelines, we will have pre-proposals for easements and fee title acquisitions due on April 30th. Those are required. And then by July 31st, we'd like to have pre-proposals due for planning grant applications. Those are not required, but we're happy to offer technical assistance and feedback on them if we get them. And so we'd turn all that around by July 24th, let everyone know what we thought, and then have final applications due on August 28th. So with that, I'll return to the recommended action before you, which is to adopt the Round 6 guidelines for the Sustainable Ag Lands Conservation Program.
Thank you. Lots to digest there. I'm going to ask for questions and comments from up here first, then public comment, and then we will make a motion if so, if somebody does that. Wade.
Thanks so much. It's an impressive program and obviously a tool that can be very helpful in the SGC's overall mission. Maybe two questions. One would be, is there any sort of a proactive assessment of where sprawl risks are greatest in the state, and therefore any, would it even be appropriate to do any sort of proactive recruitment of areas where the risk is greatest? Part of the question I have is, are we only sort of reactively considering applications that may be in areas that we would prioritize less? Because as I look at the resources, they're obviously being put to good use, but they're quite limited in terms of the number of acres that we can provide protection to. So that would be number one. Is there any potential to identify areas of greatest acute risk and therefore shape a program to attract those areas? And then secondly, has there been or will there be any periodic assessment of the effectiveness of the program? Recognizing that I think we're 5 or 6 years in, I could be wrong on that. And in my experience, sometimes it's helpful to have these periodic assessments to just understand if the tool is performing as anticipated.
Okay, yes. So outreach to areas of greatest risk, we hope so. We've done quite a bit of planning outreach, particularly in the valley where we see sprawl eat up more prime farmland than elsewhere, and in Santa Clara Valley where there's also quite a bit of development pressure. We are always interested in doing more of that. The places where we see the most growth are often the places that have the most prime farmland that is lost first. So we're certainly interested in that, and have done it a little bit, but I think in the last year we've really stepped up our staff commitment to planning, not only with our own staff, but with the engagement of technical assistance providers. We have a contract right now with an entity called Cultivate LLC, and they've been working for the last year to engage with potential planning applicants that wouldn't otherwise have the capacity to put together plans, do outreach and community engagement, and then to ultimately hopefully bring those to the council for awards in the coming year. And we're planning to re-up that program for another year. And then as far as assessment of the program, we are interested in that, and we did a little of it with Denny Grossman at OPR. What we found was that a lot of the predictive modeling for where development would have happened isn't based in existing general plans. The program, as I understand it, runs a model 100 times and looks at the percent of time that development happens in a particular pixel, but that there isn't a kind of a statewide gathering of all the general plans, all the planning information, and so it's not necessarily based in what local governments are thinking about doing right now. So when I think of an assessment of the program, I think, what places would there have been growth that there isn't as a result of this? And it's just really hard to tell because we don't have that modeling. There are a lot of people who do more work on this than me, so I would be happy to hear suggestions. And I think we're interested in that kind of assessment. And if there are experts in the room, please come talk to me.
Thanks so much. I would just make a comment. This seems like a really effective program given its resources. I think as we think about, as we move into the next agenda item later and talk about, incentivizing housing where the state needs it, we should think about what other tools we may need to actually, disincentivize suburban sprawl. Because I'll note that just the scale of this program, just given its funding limitations, will probably not fully address, sort of the sprawl threats across a state that is 100 million acres in landmass.
Agreed. And thank you. Those are great comments. And one of the things we will talk about, but it's sort of the reality is we have more tools at the state level to do this kind of land protection than we do to incentivize housing in the right places. So it's a really interesting, those two things are really two sides of the same coin, and how do we think about them together, which I think goes into our next conversation, but this is all regional by definition, and then a lot of the housing stuff is local by definition, and how do you sort of interact with that? So it goes in part to I really like the inclusion of MPOs and COGs as applicants, because I think that gets to this point to some extent, if you're thinking about this as part of a regional plan in a really comprehensive way, instead of a separate conservation program sort of off here to the side, right? Other comments, questions? Jenny?
I really just have comments, no questions, but I just wanted to first off just commend you guys for the inclusion of management plans in as a fundable item for the easements. I think this is, as I mentioned before with our Healthy Soils Grant Program, this is a really great opportunity for growers who are entering into SALC easements to do a management plan if they choose. That management plan can then develop that plan for an application for a Healthy Soils program. So it's a really great way for our two programs to be linked a little bit more closely. So thank you guys for that. And then just big kudos to staff for the work on the fee acquisition piece. I know that has been a sticky issue for some time, and the work that you guys have done, meeting with stakeholders, hearing what the issues are, finding a solution in a pilot that works. I'm looking forward to seeing how that pilot moves forward, and I just wanted to give you guys a lot of credit for the work that you've done on that to really work on a solution for this. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's exciting. Other comments from the dais? Yeah, Kristen.
Thank you, Virginia, for your presentation. I just wanted to also comment and just say, in my prior work on the SALC program, I was aware of some of the limitations of the prior guidelines. So these adjustments are great, and I, like Jenny, I'm very excited to see the inclusion of the groundwater sustainability agencies as applicants. So kudos, and I support approval of the guidelines.
Great. And I know Jeannie Merrill is out there wanting to give a comment. While she walks up, let me just say the point that you made about, and I know Denny's made many times, who's here too, about the lack of a place to look at all the general plans and figure out how they all interact, is something we've talked about a lot, and maybe something, Louise and staff, we could think about that element as we're thinking about sort of these larger SGC questions of and data and what we need to support the larger vision, that ongoing issue of not having a place where we have all the general plans and any ability to work with them as a whole and see where growth is headed from a local perspective. That's a real challenge for us. So something to think about.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Chair, members. My name is Jeannie Merrill. I'm with the California Climate and Agriculture Network. We're a coalition of sustainable and organic agriculture organizations. We've worked on this program from the beginning, and it's really nice to see the evolution of the program. And we have a lot of fun working with the staff on this program. I think that the changes you've heard about their program today really came out of conversation with stakeholders. We're glad to see the changes, and the risk options really focus in on supporting and protecting farmland that's at risk of sprawl and rural ranchette development. I'm glad to see the fee title changes and dropping of the minimum deed turns. DOC does a great job of listening to stakeholders and really learning, and we really appreciate that. I wanted to just spend a minute or less on the management plans. We are organizations that work with farmers every day to implement healthy soils and irrigation management practices and renewable energy projects, et cetera. Farmers are ready for this. They are on the front lines of climate change. They're engaging in the department's CDFA's programs. I would just urge you to go beyond making optional management plans. We've talked for many years now of having a bridge between the SALC program and the other climate smart agriculture programs, and sort of now is the time. So for example, if you're a farmer who gets a SALC grant to permanently protect your land, and you want to turn around and apply for healthy soils or for SWEEP or the alternative manure management program, you should get extra scoring points to do that. Because you've permanently protected your land, you should go to the top of the list. Similarly, if you're already a Climate Smart Ag recipient and now you're thinking about permanently protecting your farmland so it's not sprawled upon, you should go at the top of the list. So there are ways that we can be more creative about bridging across these programs and then further incentivizing. I am concerned about a management plan that won't be updated for 10 years. We want this work to be active, proactive. We can encourage the land trusts, for example, who are active in SALC to make available information about the climate smart agriculture programs. You could even require that they put that on their website, make it available when they meet with landowners. There are lots of ways that we can be further bridging these programs, and just would like to see a little bit more on that. I'll just say one final word about the climate budget. We're really glad to see the administration proposing diversifying funding. A note of caution, though. Small and mid-scale farmers are not going to benefit from the Catalyst Fund. They can't take out loans to do healthy soils projects. They can't take out a loan on their dairy to turn their compost, or turn their manure rather into compost. They simply can't do it. So we're very glad to see diversifying funding and seeing general fund dollars for the program like SWEEP, the State Water Efficiency Enhancement Program. We need to see more general fund dollars. GGRF is going away and really need your support in making sure that we see both bond and general fund dollars for these programs. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jeannie. Appreciate it. I also have a card from Katie Patterson for this item.
Good afternoon. Katie Patterson, American Farmland Trust. So many areas to cover today. First is appreciation to SGC and to the hardworking DOC staff here. As Jeannie said, continue increments, of improvement to this program and finessing it. And it's a great way to consider, how can we make this program optimized, for the stakeholders that we're trying to reach here. A few things. I do want to echo Jeannie's comment specifically on the Climate Catalyst Fund. We too, it's a hard thing. I was in local government. We dealt with a revolving loan fund. Highest risk projects takes a lot of time to get those projects developed, far enough along to make sure that those can be the right investments for the community. One of our talking points is that we really do see that there could be some major investments in proven projects like our Climate Smart Ag programs that are getting those investments now into the savings account for California's climate needs. I did want to take a couple of moments just to respond to Secretary Crowfoot's comments in terms of the trickiness that we have around planning and how we're addressing where that highest risk is. As we know, a lot of the communities were founded on really great prime farm ag land, in the valley specifically, where American Farmland Trust is focusing its efforts. We have a tool, it's called Data Basin, and we're looking at, how we can drop in some layers that are specific to the SALC program here to see what projects, rise to the top and would be really valuable for the SALC program. Does it also, enhance groundwater recharge? Does it hit, right around a community's, proposed build out? So things like that are what we're doing right now and how we're engaging around the land use plan and program. It would be great if we could have a general plan clearinghouse to really, and see that get converted into a GIS map, to take that data, because I think that's really needed. But again, it's an extraordinarily tricky issue. It's all local. And unless we can get those local, general plans to drive towards policies, not just goals, it makes it challenging. These MPOs, they have a lot of, they're kind of teethless, beings. It feels good. We're regional. We're coming together. We have some good common things, but we need some teeth to it also to make sure that it gets done and the outcomes are being achieved. Otherwise, it's kind of like a heartless pep rally. So that's one of the things that we want to focus on too, and that's where the planning grants are extraordinarily powerful because it creates the space for communities to be really creative and engage in that way. So we're excited. We think that the Sigma, rules that are out there and engagement is really going to force people to think about their planning in their communities differently, and that's a place that we're ready to engage with them as well. As for the easements, American Farmland Trust is really excited about new tools like Buy, Protect, Sell, and we look forward to working with the staff here to develop that in a way that's meaningful and can really, create another tool, on the landscape of what, farmland protection implementation looks like. It was a really robust process in terms of all the stakeholders coming together, and for that I appreciate, the effort and the convening that SGC has done around this issue. And this is a program that everyone is looking to across the nation. In New York, I've said this before, they want to implement something similar to this, and they are very excited about our work. So thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Really appreciate those comments. Any other questions or comments from up here before we vote? Go ahead, Nicole.
I just have a question. So I am confused, and you all know more than I do, but it's confusing to me, unless I didn't hear it right, that the state does not have a map of where all the housing elements, all of the local governments have mapped where the housing's going. Because number one, don't you have to do that for the RENA process? Doesn't every local government have to submit their housing elements? And then the MPOs, when they're doing the regional transportation plans, it's all modeled based on the general plans of all the cities and counties in the region.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start and Kate probably can weigh in. I mean, we don't have digitized general plans for all communities in the state. And so, I mean, that there's just not a single digital layer that has all of those data in one place.
So when they submit, it's just a paper document or something? Or
I don't know, as I understand, I don't know that we get it down to the level of granularity too with things like zoning and all of that. But I don't know, Kate, if you want to say more.
Yeah, I mean, the housing element is the one required element, right? And the housing element, people use different formats and different types of models and different granularity and different all kinds of things. So it's hard. You have to kind of get that organized and digital to create it. And then, yes, the MPOs to some extent aggregate that, but, whatever way they do it, I mean, they're not all doing it in the same way either. And the RENA numbers are really top down. So the RENA numbers are, what does this region need to do? And then there's a whole bunch of running around with underneath that to figure out how to get there. Alexis, did you want to talk to this? Because HCD collects a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, so for the housing element, local governments are required to submit their housing element to HCD, but there's not a mandate on the format or what it looks like, and obviously different jurisdictions have different levels of sophistication. HCD does track each jurisdiction to make sure that they remain in compliance, and if they don't, then we have some new enforcement tools to go after them. RENA, it's sort of a negotiation between HCD and the Council of Governments on the methodology and how they distribute those allocations, and then it's really up to the Council of Government to distribute that with their memberships at the local level. So again, there's not one digitized
I think,
place.
It'd be good for us to connect with American Farmland Trust as well, because the analysis that Virginia mentioned that Denny Grossman led actually is also using the database and platform, which was actually very helpful for looking at some of the co-benefits that go along with these projects and sort of where they're sitting relative to protected lands or, groundwater recharge, things like that. So that, I think, is something where there's, we started down that road. It sounds like American Farmland Trust is as well. I think where we could go on is maybe trying to take, if we can't do it statewide, is looking at a specific area where there might be data where we could look at the general, there are jurisdictions where you could do that. It's just hard to do statewide. We just don't have consistent data, but we could probably pick a jurisdiction and do a pilot and see what that could look like.
Yeah, I mean, again, having worked on RTPs in San Diego, like they always tell us where the housing, like they aggregate all the general plans of the 18 cities in the county, and they have, they show us the pretty GIS maps of where all the housing's planned. So again, but I have no idea about Orange County. I don't know anything else about any other region, but so yeah, start with San Diego.
Yeah, wait.
Question for Jenny. So I look at this summary of our agricultural programs that are sort of at the intersection of environmental conservation and agriculture, and I think it's so exciting. Thanks to Secretary Ross and your leadership, we have this remarkable set of programs, and I think everybody up to the governor is really excited to expand those. So I was intrigued with Jeannie's comment or suggestion around creating stronger bridges among the programs, and specifically those other programs and SALC. And I'm not suggesting we necessarily change the guidelines here today, but can you just talk about what you all at the Department of Food and Agriculture see as potential to strengthen the synergies between the programs?
Yeah, and I know we've had some conversations maybe a year or two back, time flies sometimes, but about how do we embed more into the scoring criteria for SALC if they've received Healthy Soils funds in the past. And I think I took a note, and I think that's duly noted for our program as well, looking at how we can at least give additional points in those scoring criterias.
Yeah, and
we are gearing up to put our RFP out, so it won't be for this year, but.
Yeah, the SALC selection criteria has some points that are given for agricultural management practices that are kind of in the healthy soils sustainability realm. So we try to give a nod to that.
Yeah, but I think the management plan, the ability for an applicant that's receiving SALC funds to do $10,000 management plan. We're having similar conversations on the Healthy Soils program, also funding some management, looking at whether there's the potential to fund management plans. Those management plans, the conservation plans or climate smart ag or carbon farm plans, they have different names. We'll generally call them management plans. Those are really the first step for a grower in thinking about what are the conservation practices that they can start to implement on farm, kind of looking at that whole suite. It wouldn't all happen in 1 year. So really starting to think of that through. And so I think that is a really great opportunity for the SALC program and the Healthy Soils program to be much more supportive of each other, intertwined a lot more. So I'd say that these management plans are actually a big step in that direction for starting to do that more. And I know there's a lot of opportunity for our staff to continue to work together, I think, again, on the scoring criteria on our end, probably more than you guys for that as well.
That's really helpful. Another comment that I have that was reflected in both Jeannie and Katie's comments are helpful to hear what you all understand to be limitations of the Climate Catalyst Fund and its applicability on small and medium-sized farmers. I'll share with you and underscore what Kate said. Part of the climate budget proposal from the governor this year is a recognition that we need to diversify and expand our funding sources to tackle climate change, just given now what we know about just the scale of the challenge, both to reduce carbon pollution and to help our communities and natural places be more resilient. So I would ask you this, which is, within agriculture, and so part of that is just diversifying from a grant-only approach and really understanding maybe there are different financial mechanisms that can be used that can leverage other monies and get us further along. So while we have the grant programs, what are low-interest loan programs, no-interest loan programs, risk reduction programs, et cetera? So my question back to you, just on a broadly, not for answering now, is, okay, well, what are non-grant programs, what are non-grant funding mechanisms that could be helpful to help agricultural producers make the transitions that we're excited for them to make moving forward? Because I do think we want to diversify beyond and add to our grant-only programs. And then lastly, I'll just say I'm really proud of the Department of Conservation and the fact that they're in our agency. And I'm really also proud of just the way that the team at SGC talks about your work in partnership with them. So thank you for all that you do.
Thank you for that. That's really nice.
Thank you, Wade. And just to underscore what you just said, also wanted to really just say that the inclusion of the Catalyst Fund in the budget is not should not be taken as a signal that we're getting rid of grant programs, because we're very committed to grant programs. We're just really trying to figure out where grants are most necessary and where there are opportunities to expand beyond that and really expand the whole reach of our whole set of actions. And that's sort of what the challenge back to everybody is how can you help us do that? Because that's where we're all going. The last thing on the housing question, I'll say that a listener at home has texted me that SB 6 last year required that all of the sites that local jurisdictions are planning to use to meet their RENA allocations are now provided to HCD on a parcel by parcel basis. So we actually will, by 2021, so we will have more information from the local jurisdictions on how they're going to meet RENA, and we'll be keeping that. But it looks like it may not be mapped; it may be data. So that's another interesting point, just in terms of that translation of data to mapping is always a challenge. But thank you, Natalie, for that. OPR legal counsel sending me texts. Great. Well, I think we are back to the recommended action unless there's any other comments from anyone. And again, I just want to echo just thank you to Department of Conservation, to Virginia, to the staff, to everybody on this program, which we all really, it's very satisfying to see sort of the idea to action and the real outcomes of the program and the benefits. So thank you for that. So, recommended action, adopt the draft final round 6 guidelines for the Sustainable Agricultural Land Conservation Program. That, of course, includes all of the updates that Virginia just gave us on all the different elements. Do we have a motion on that?
I would move to adopt the draft final round 6 guidelines.
And I'll second that.
Can we do a roll call?
Secretary Podesta,
Aye.
Secretary Lester Moffitt,
Aye.
Deputy Secretary Peer,
Aye.
Assistant Secretary Olson Morgan,
Aye.
Secretary Crowfoot, Undersecretary Kovo, Dr. Gordon,
Yes.
Nicole Capritz,
Aye.
and Mike Flad.
Aye.
So moved. Thank you. And thanks for all the work you put into this. And thank you for the public comments too, Jeannie and Katie. Really appreciate it. All right, moving to big ticket agenda item on strategy that Louise is going to set us up for now.
Great. Well, thank you all. And thank you, Virginia and team. That's all wonderful. Great work. So our final item on the agenda is to talk through a work plan for 2020. And this is really in response to several of the conversations we had last year at various council meetings about how do we utilize the structure and the collaboration and the model that SGC provides to really advance the innovative program work that we do, as evidenced in SALC, but also AHSC and TCC. All of those programs have been built up over the 10 years that SGC has been around, using the expertise of all of you all and your agencies and departments, on the dais. And I think are really demonstrating how we can think about a state that is growing in a way that addresses a diversity of goals, whether that's climate and environment, public health, and equity. And so I think you challenged us to go back and think about what more could we do moving beyond our programs, and really think, we're doing those, and then how do we sort of ripple out from there? And so we, across SGC staff, across key staff, in other conversations, really tried to dig in over the last few months to think about what could we do in this year to really, I think this is an important step for SGC in our evolution, to think about not being, and I don't want to say just, because I think our role as a funding entity is incredibly important and having real impacts. How do we add on to that, and how do we build on to that to really move into how we can utilize that as a model and our collaborative approaches to push that out so it becomes more of a norm and not just something that we at SGC are doing. And so we, through a number of conversations, came up with a proposed 2020 work plan that we would ask the council to consider adopting. But really not just as is, I think also intended to be a fodder for discussion, to get feedback so that we can really, focus our efforts. And so, as I said, we developed this through our key staff meetings, through our SGC staff conversations. We had a planning retreat earlier this year where we discussed this sort of pivot for SGC and really, if we lean in on our collaborative role over the coming year, what could this look like? We really wanted to build on our enabling statute and the statutes that frame up our programs and provide our direction. And we wanted to lay this out as a one-year plan, indicating that this is not, we're just sort of setting something in stone and going forward, but how do we really think about a step in this year that we can come back to and we can revisit and evolve. The conversation really wanted, again, to focus on this collaborative work and to directly advance administration priorities. And I think very nicely, I think the governor's State of the State set it up really well, which is really thinking about how do we address and grow as a state, and growing in the right places and in the right ways. And I think that fits very nicely into what SGC was created to do, which is really to think about what does the future of the state and as we grow, what does that look like? And I think following the campfire, Secretary John Laird, when he was here, was talking about an issue, and he said, this is a question of strategic growth. And I think what is clear is right now we're at a time where we really need to think about strategic growth, and we need to think about what is the state going to look like. And so I think this is for many reasons. I'll walk through a few, not that anyone probably needs to be convinced, but I think it is important to tie it back to things that we know as they relate to the goals the state's trying to achieve. One is on climate change. We are committed to becoming carbon neutral, and we know that transportation continues to be this vexing challenge for us as a state, where we're not seeing the progress that we're seeing in other sectors. And so, I think at a meeting last year, Secretary Crowfoot raised the issue of how do we tackle this, and what does that mean? Transportation is entwined in so many elements of how we grow. And I think another of these is really thinking about housing in California and where our challenge is. And this is just from HCD looking at housing production, the decline, and just the need that we have and how far below that we currently are. And so we need to be producing housing. We need to be producing housing for all of our citizens to address issues of equity and health. Housing is an incredibly important social determinant of health. So having housing is central to being successful and achieving more equity across our state. But this comes coupled with our affordability challenge, where we know housing is becoming increasingly out of the reach of many, many people. And when you look at this coupled with transportation costs, these things coming together, we know that people are especially burdened by high costs of housing, which then lead them to move further and further away, higher costs of transportation, increasing the inequities that we see across regions and for individuals across the state. And so as we tackle and think about growth for the state, and thinking about a California for all, we all felt we really needed to lean in on thinking about what is it around, how do we advance an agenda around strategic growth? And we've talked a lot about how do we want to align our investments and how do we work together as different agencies to advance this? And so we came up with a work plan that has two elements. The first is establishing a set of priorities for strategic growth, which then lead into an agenda for action and building an action plan. The first element here, I think, is incredibly important. And I think as we had a number of conversations last year and started looking at data in a couple of places and thinking about, are we aligned? It's very hard to ask that question in the abstract. Are we aligned? Well, sure, we all get together and we meet and we all sort of agree climate change is a problem, but we don't have concrete priorities or principles to ground that alignment. And so what we agreed as a group, and particularly we iterated on these several times through our key staff discussions, was let's try to come up with a set of priorities. And let's come up with an initial set of priorities, recognizing you could list a lot of things. So we tried to really focus those priorities to think about how can they provide us direction for alignment. We specifically call them 2020 priorities, not because we're going to solve them in 2020, but recognizing we want this to be something we can revisit. We wanted those to reflect our state priorities, our council statute, and then really to build on, I think, the success that we've seen in SGC's programs. And then I think with those strategies, it helps really to provide, those priorities for strategic growth really helps to provide a framework for how we can advance an agenda for action. And I think the key thing that came out here is there is so much work happening, and I think just in the conversations we had just around SALC, there are important conversations that are happening about how are we thinking about climate smart ag and land management. There's also ongoing conversations with SALC and Sigma. And so we have housing and transportation conversations happening. So a lot of this is also starting with a map of what are we doing and how are all these things fitting together? Where are there gaps? What can we lift up? But really building that into a more cohesive and integrated action plan for the state that focuses on investments, programs and policy, partnership and collaboration, and then the barriers. What are the things that are in the way? I think I could add another bullet here from the last conversation that is around data, and how do we advance some of this work? So I'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail, but then mostly leave it open for discussion. But I wanted to go through the priorities, and I took the liberty of just underlining a few words because I do think they hit on a number of important sort of topics, but I think these are not just siloed topics in and of themselves. But the first priority was to increase housing supply and support other development through infill and efficient development patterns, taking advantage of existing infrastructure. So this could be taking advantage of currently developed areas, existing transportation infrastructure, or how we reuse and are using existing buildings. The second is to protect and manage natural and working lands for open space, for agriculture, recreation, habitat, resilience, and other ecosystem services. So really recognizing the importance of natural spaces at all different scales. So thinking, in an urban area out to a more rural setting. To increase mobility options so that Californians can access jobs, schools, and other destinations through transit and active transportation. So a focus on mobility, and especially mobility as it ties to opportunity and thinking about jobs, economic development, education. Advancing equity by targeting investments towards communities and people who have faced historic disadvantage, giving voice to community residents and shaping their community and their region's future. So of course, this is our foundational equity principle, but I think also speaks to the increasing importance of a model where we're building community capacity and doing a lot more ground up work, and recognizing that this growth and how we grow is a partnership, and how do we really catalyze that type of partnership. Improving public health by building healthy and complete communities and neighborhoods. And so again, recognizing health, importantly, healthcare services, but also the social determinants of health and the communities and places in which people live and play and work are exceptionally important for determining health outcomes. And then finally, thinking about how we grow in the face of climate risk and how we ensure we're increasing community resilience. And I would say that's both through physical infrastructure, but also social systems and economic systems that can withstand and build resilience in the face of climate risk. So those are the 6 priorities that as a group we articulated to start with. Recognizing, again, they're not distinct in and of themselves, but really work together. I think equity cuts across all of them. I think all of these also speak to building more resilience. So we tried to call those out, but also recognize they do cut through. So again, with those priorities, which we would welcome input and discussion around, we see those leading into and helping frame an agenda for action and helping us think as we look across activities, how are we advancing these priorities? And I think importantly, being cognizant of the fact that we may have trade-offs. And how do we do that? How do we recognize those and be explicit about them as we move forward? So in thinking about building up an agenda for action, we do not need to start from scratch. We have a tremendous amount of work that is underway. And so we really want to utilize as a starting point really the power of you all as a council and the leadership of you all as a council to help to convene some strategic and focused dialogues on housing, transportation, and growth. So both at a higher level state agency, so a few strategic conversations there where we can at a leadership level really identify what are the opportunities and how can those feed into commitments, plans, and needs moving forward. And then I think as the Strategic Growth Council, we cannot do that without a parallel conversation that we're having at the local and regional scale. And so really understanding how those how the local and regional partners, community members, as well as governments and other stakeholders are a part of this action agenda. A lot of these conversations, I should say, are happening already. And so our first step is really we want to actually just do a much more explicit mapping of all of those activities that could shape where we can add value as SGC in doing these convenings. And so we do really want to lift up and advance those actions that are underway and be strategic that we're additive, we're filling gaps, and we're building in something that is more complete and integrative through this work. And so ultimately what we would like to work towards is an action plan for strategic growth. And that is really an action that action plan the council can advance that would support realizing those priorities for strategic growth. I mentioned already that we would talk about investment strategy. And I think starting with with SGC's programs and really looking at how our programs are working together and how they are working with other programs. So for instance, SALC and Climate Smart Ag. Really thinking about how we're strategically using our programs to advance these priorities. And then really looking at policy and program alignment more generally, partnership and collaboration, and again, barriers. I think a really important piece of this is then, of course, metrics and how do we track our progress. And so working to build out a set of metrics that map to those priorities that we can be tracking along the way. And focusing on near and midterm actions. So there is always a role for a long-term vision for the state, and OPR has the statutory role to do that. And so this is not intended to take the place of something that is a longer-term look for the state, because there's a lot of important work to be done there, but really to focus on things we can be doing in within all of our timelines that we're here. So Alexis by Friday. No, no. But it really is intended to be something that is more of a near and midterm type of action plan that can advance this administration's priorities and goals. And so we will be bringing on additional support to help have these conversations be facilitated and be really ensure that they are guiding and leading towards a concrete action plan and can help to solicit and be as effective and efficient as possible in advancing this conversation. So our next steps are to do a staff level convening, and I think really we have incredible, the agency staff has been exceptionally valuable in building out this sort of idea of a plan. But I think we want to dig a little deeper and go into program and department level staff to start doing some mapping of ongoing and planned activities. And so this is so we can really get a sense of what is moving forward, what are the pieces that are going on just fine and we can let them go and we can all learn from them? Where are there opportunities to make connections? How can we add and support the work that's happening? And so really, again, do that mapping to understand opportunities for collaboration, gaps and needs, and to really map out next steps. We would like to probably do 3 state agency convenings over this next 6 to 9 months that would be informed by that mapping exercise. And then also run alongside those local and regional dialogues to understand work that's happening at the local and regional scale and how they fit together. And then presenting a draft action plan to the council in the fall of 2020. And I did want to I will wrap up quickly with just a sense we already have some ideas of activities that are happening that we know we will be building on. One I said already, our own program implementation work, as well as our program development work as we're developing the Regional Climate Collaboratives program through SB 1072. That work is underway, and so really how we're utilizing that. We have a number of us here involved in the Housing and Transportation Work Group, which is doing tremendous work to think about linkages between housing and transportation programs. The Health and All Policies Task Force, which is co-run by the Department of Public Health, SGC, and the Public Health Institute, has been advancing a lot of these action plans over the years to think about how we're embedding health and equity into a lot of programs, and has been advancing that work also again on housing and transportation, and so how we can build that into this conversation. The Regions Rise Together work that OPR and GoBiz are leading. Assembly Bill 285, which directs SGC to look at the California Transportation Plan, pending the budget. If the budget is approved, with staffing and work, and analytical work to do that, that will be another important element that we can utilize to advance some of this work. And then, of course, just the housing program implementation work that is underway at HCD, which we're already having active conversations around program alignment there, but can continue to do more. And so that's just a small sampling of that work. Ongoing conversations around natural and working lands are critically important for how that fits into this space as well. So I just did want to emphasize we're absolutely not starting from scratch, which may or may not make it harder, but I think there's just a tremendous amount of work for us to build on here. And so with that, I will conclude, and we can open it up for discussion and questions.
Thank you, Louise. That's a lot. And thanks for including the natural working lands at the end there. Also, just all the water conversations, since they're so relevant to growth, right? I mean, there's no way to separate water availability from growth in the state or from climate resilience. And so I think that's another important set of things that are going on. And I'd love to hear from here. I mean, I'd love to ask, just to start, given the set of things that are happening, and there's sort of, I think one of the great things about this administration, at least from my perspective, is just the sheer amount of interagency collaboration that's happening all the time. What are you thinking about this sort of unique value add? I think there's a lot of ways to answer the question. I could even come up with some, but love your thoughts about sort of what is the piece that SGC, is it the secretary level engagement? Is it the local stakeholder involvement? Is it the projects as examples? I mean, there's a lot of ways to answer that question, but sort of where are you thinking?
I mean, I think for this work, I think the secretary level engagement is critically important, to have the leadership around the idea that all of these pieces should and need to work together to advance a vision of what strategic growth means for California. And so I think that secretary level engagement is critically important. And I think that engagement has been demonstrated in the effectiveness of our programs. All of our programs were built to reflect input of all of our council member agencies and our public members who bring really important local perspectives or other expertise. And so that's really important. So I do think that it's really the leadership side of things, and knowing that as representatives of the administration, this is a priority, and we all are committed to making these pieces work together. And I think there's a tremendous amount of great work happening, and I think how do we all collaboratively kind of own it together as something we're all doing, and recognizing that doesn't mean everything becomes ours, but how do we lift up and amplify, and how can we help? Basically, I think we as a collaborative body can help to propel some of the individual activities that are happening.
I thought the local government piece was the most important piece, but I'll chime in there. But but I do think it's a critical piece. I think as we're looking to integrate, coordinate horizontally, we really need to focus on the vertical piece. And I really appreciate that you include the local listening sessions and planning with local and regional folks, but really want to make sure we're taking that to heart. I think there's a lot of, at the local level, it feels like mandates, right, that are coming down. So it's either money or mandates. It's either, a grant will motivate us to head in one direction, or a mandate will push local government to go away from a certain direction. But I think we have a real opportunity to explain why we're doing and why the administration is doing what it's doing, and really start to capture sort of the minds and the hearts of local leaders, elected officials, bureaucrats like myself, city managers that want to do the right thing. As you said, it's about doing the right thing. If we know why the administration feels a certain thing is the right thing, I think you'll get a lot more buy-in, and we'll get a lot more movement at the local level if local folks are brought in early and can really help drive this initiative. So I don't know what that looks like per se in terms of a vertical integration or collaboration. I'm looking at ILG does a great job. We've partnered, the Strategic Growth Council has partnered with ILG, and the city managers groups, League of California Cities and Contract Cities, and these different groups. We talk about it a lot. We talk about RENA numbers. We talk about the linkages between transportation and housing. Some of it is purely capacity, and you touched on that. I think especially representing an under-resourced community, we have significant capacity issues. So goals that are targeted towards increasing the capacity go a long way towards, I think, helping local government not just understand what we're trying to achieve and why we're trying to achieve it, but actually the capacity to do it. So I think you touched on all of it in there. I just want to make sure that I'm bringing the point home that we're vertigrating. We're integrating vertically as well as horizontally. We're vertigrating. Yeah, we're creating new words.
It's a new word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Wade, did you want to jump in?
Well, thanks, Louise, and thanks for you and your staff for taking the time to come up with what I think is a bold suggestion. I've long thought since over the last year that, we all recognize that the SGC does a really good job within its grant-making programs, and that's an important function. But I've been really interested in whether we can use our presence together in this institution for even something more than that. So to your point, not to take away from the funding programs, but to really build on that. It's very clear that, to me, that housing is and should be a priority, the priority that we focus on in that work. The governor and the legislature are on the same page. It's sort of a call to arms. Everybody chips in on this effort. My agency, and I think a lot of the agencies up here, aren't directly related into housing production. And I think actually this effort within SGC could help us within our agencies understand what can we be doing. Because frankly, if you ask me, and I'm being honest, I don't really know yet what we could be doing. So I think that's really helpful. I take the points that what we don't want to do is create a lot of process without actually concrete actions that we can take. I do think that really addressing the barriers on what is preventing us at the state from being more helpful would be constructive. And this is all not to get in the way of the agencies and departments that are most centrally involved, but really complementing their efforts. Lastly, I'll say any objective analysis suggests that we're not building enough housing, that our VMT is headed in the wrong direction. And if you think about SB 375, the bill that really precipitated or was the genesis of this council, was really to help us grow as a state and grow in an environmentally beneficial way. And I think on both counts, we're really struggling. So I think we need to take a gut check, and I think this would be a good activity for this year to really assess what can we do as the Strategic Growth Council to complement this effort to really make sure that we are growing more and growing in appropriate ways.
Jenny, then Kristen.
Yeah, I'll just certainly echo what Secretary Crowfoot said, and add on. And I think when Karen and I discussed this last week, there's just big kudos to you, Louise, and all of the staff for pulling this together. I know we had a conversation at the council at the last meeting, and I think this document really reflects a lot of what the council discussed. So first off, I want to say thank you for that. One thing that we would love to make sure is included in, I know you've mentioned it in your notes, is the nexus of water and SGMA implementation, and how SGMA implementation, especially in agricultural areas, because that's what we're focused on, but throughout the state is going to affect land use changes and how that interacts with both housing, transportation, natural and working lands, and the like. So that's a key thing to also be mindful of, as well as we have all of these really great conversations in the next year. But thank you for all of your work pulling this together.
Thanks, Jenny. Kristen?
Thanks, Louise. So I haven't personally been involved in the development of this plan, but I did speak to the secretary before the meeting and read through it. And I think, we both agree that it's a really good starting point, and it seems like, a good framework for moving forward. But I think the secretary especially was concerned about lack of specificity. And Wade, you touched on this, that it possibly creates more process and more, convenings and meetings without a clear vision for what is to come out of them. And so if there was a way, like, for example, on page 3, you talk about development of measurable outcomes for each of the principles. It seems like perhaps those should be in the work plan, so that it's clear what folks are aiming to achieve from the convenings. And also, notably absent was reference to some of the things that SGC has been working on so far this year, like the climate bond, and also, the grant programs that are happening, continually, but also this year. So those were just some of the comments that Secretary Blumenfeld had. Thinks it's a great start, but maybe needs some further fleshing out before it's ready for prime time.
Yeah.
So I wanted to echo sort of a lot of what I've heard here. I just first want to say that I think this represents tremendous work by the staff, and really I've had the opportunity to sort of work with the Strategic Growth Council for the last 6 or 7 years, and just over time really want to remark on the growth of the council, which is, I think, largely been propelled by some really excellent staff work, as well as support from this bench of leaders. And I really appreciate that we're at this really pivotal kind of transitional moment where, without taking anything away from the strength and the true significance of the grant programs that the council works on, that there's this opportunity to really break down some of the silos that we work with in state government. And it seems like broadly beyond our council, but led by our governor and our state leaders, as well as our local leaders, we're seeing just an increased acknowledgement of how you can't pull these issues apart. An environmental issue is a health issue, is a housing issue, is a transportation issue, and transportation issues are aging issues and mobility issues and disability issues. And so I really appreciate sort of the gestalt of these priorities and that effort to really break down those silos. And I also agree that, we're in a difficult world right now. There's it's exciting. It's a really exciting world. There's a lot of different initiatives going on that cross walk with each other. And so I do think there's really an opportunity to utilize this body, which has this access to these tremendous leaders, to try to sort of get our arms around all of those initiatives and see where those gaps are. And for me, I think the sort of driving things to keep in mind would be, as have sort of already been identified, but really driving towards like, what does this really look like concretely, so that it's not just a process, as you've identified and Wade, and really making sure that there's a concrete outcome, and really focusing, as Kate said, I think it's really also important to make sure that we're focused on the unique add of SGC. So what can SGC bring to the table? And as Louise said, to lift up, not necessarily own, but what is that extra add that SGC has that perhaps other agencies and other entities that are already in the space don't have access to? So overall, huge kudos as well.
Thank you. I'm going to go this way and then back this way. So down to Alexis.
Cool. Thank you. So first, I just want to commend all of the great work. And I love that this is a starting focus that can evolve. I think that was a really smart strategy there, because as we all know, these issues do evolve. And so to have a sole focus indefinitely is not always the smartest starting strategy. So just to piggyback on a couple of comments, when we did the bus tour with the governor right out of the gate a little over a year ago, and then following that, I sat down with the governor and folks from HCD and jurisdictions who were out of their housing element compliance. We had just filed a lawsuit against Huntington Beach that got everybody very nervous. We heard often that when local governments were given their RHNA numbers by the Council of Government, sure, they could build, but there wasn't safe drinking water available to those units. And so that was prohibiting them from doing that, right? So I think there are a lot of areas where we could work together, and how we communicate with our local governments, how we help them plan in their communities, even if we could develop some best practices that we see working well in some areas that maybe other areas could benefit from. So I think that is a plus that this body could do, given that we all have sort of our lanes and our own contacts with local governments, but we don't actually share that information. I think the other component, and I know this is mentioned in the action plan or the work plan, but is tackling resiliency. As vehicle miles traveled goes up and housing goes down, we also have communities that are literally burning down or being damaged by natural disaster. And so I think building that in and weaving that in as we really tackle how we're going to rebuild these communities and also protect communities in the future from these types of disasters and bouncing back is going to be huge. So yeah, I think it's important to note that the state doesn't actually drill water lines or build housing, right? So back to the local government point, it's incredibly important that we are hearing what our local governments need and doing what we can to support them so they do what we need them to do.
Anybody? I think you were next. Nicole, Alyssa.
The last one. Well, thank you for the discussion and for the excellent work plan. I would say that I think this aligns with all of the work that we're doing with the Housing and Transportation Working Group and Steering Committee, and this is a great venue to bring some of that work up to the dais here and to share with folks. So that's the other thing that I think that's important about the SGC and having a work plan and having a common set of priorities that we can all talk about in our respective agencies and departments, and then we bring back the results of those discussions and coordination and activities or grant awards, whatever it might be, back to this forum. And then it's an iterative process. And so I think the work plan is a very the next step in evolving those discussions and really pushing the work forward. So I think it's a great idea.
Thank you. Nicole?
Thank you. And thank you, everybody. I echo everybody's comments. No surprise, I'm going to lift up the idea of the local governments. I would add, because you have the key staff will convene with, or you have SGC will convene with key staff and other partners, I think you should get the top legislators involved, like their offices and key staff members, because I'm assuming there's going to be new legislation on the horizon that either comes out of this process or it's just going to come up organically. There's apparently a new set of housing bills that are about to drop. How is that interfacing with our other state goals? I just think you need to bring them to the table at the front end and get them to invest and buy into this process as well as the conversation. So that also includes the MPOs. Absolutely, they are the conveners, at least in San Diego and Orange County, of all the local government officials, and they just have that space to really hear from the community. And so I think when I first joined SGC, this is still during the Brown administration, there was conversation of MPOs actually distributing some of the grant funds themselves. And I don't know the magic answer to that, but I think that has to be part of the conversation about how we integrate the MPOs. And so there's more autonomy and more, again, buy-in to the sort of shift we have to make about how we grow and develop and how we move people around, because we're not there. When you work in the local level, I think Mike can attest, we're not there. So there's a lot of legwork to do. But I'm a person who believes in that change happens from the bottom up. I don't believe in top-down change. And so if you don't have right now, you don't have, well, SB 50 failed. You don't have that. That alignment is not there yet. But part of it is just education. That's why I was so grateful that the state, a lot of Kate and others came down, because there's a lot the state officials and everybody here has to offer to help educate our local, explain the reasoning and rationale behind sort of the state goals. The people just don't make the connections that everybody here makes easily and clearly. They just don't, and our local officials don't. And so in any case, yes, I'm totally in favor of this, looking forward to seeing the progress. And the only other thing is on the 2020, it's a 2020 action plan, but we don't see anything till fall 2020. So I'm not sure, I didn't really totally understand the 2020 versus.
Yeah, so maybe the actions are.
Okay. Well, just hopefully because obviously we're not doing much for 2020.
Right.
Okay. So anyhow, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Those are really good comments. I just wanted to add a couple and actually sort of maybe integrate some of the ones that I've heard. Yeah, I think this question, maybe I started with it and others echoed it, but this sort of question, and I know we've talked about it too, of what's the SGC is this amazing asset, and so what is the thing that really it brings to the table that can kind of advance the goals that we all have been talking about? And there's a couple things that have come up in a number of comments, and you talked about too, Louise. One is this kind of timescale issue. You made the point about kind of short to midterm. I would almost say there's a set of things that happen because they're crises and they're immediate and everybody is involved in them and everyone's running around trying to figure them out, right? Today it's the coronavirus and homelessness. It's just, but it's like things like that are incredibly immediate and very hard to do super strategically because you're in a moment of crisis. But if you've done a lot of the strategic thinking, then those moments become opportunities to actually advance strategy. So that just seems like, it doesn't seem like we're talking about that crisis moment timescale. It also, as you pointed out, I think the long-term planning OPR stuff, which is like multi-decadal, is not exactly what we're talking about. It really feels like there's something in the middle of those two things where it's, maybe RENA is a great example of that. So you get your housing allocation numbers and how do we, and this goes to sort of what's the role of the agencies or SGC, how do we make sure that what's happening at the agencies isn't creating barriers to implementing that in a way that is going in the right direction, right? So there's principles, and then we have this opportunity to develop something over a year or two, and then how do we make sure we're not all operating across purposes? We're not putting a bunch of housing in a place with no transit where it's next to a freeway and there's no safe drinking water. I mean, just as an example, right? Because it's cheap, right, to do that. Or it's in a floodplain and there's no attention paid to that or whatever. So that timescale thing seems really important. So like, what is it that we're trying, like the principles, what are we trying to affect with the principles? And then how does that percolate through the agencies themselves, not just at a sort of a thought partner level here, if that makes sense. And then the other thing that I heard, again, sort of facilitating getting to those principles without creating barriers to them inadvertently, often. And then the point that Nicole just made, I thought was really important on the kind of regions as a really important kind of geography for this conversation, because so much of what we're talking about is not confined to municipal boundaries. It's not, the commute sheds are not municipal. The land, you know, the kind of interaction between, balance between the natural working lands and the infill development is not local. And a lot of the climate resilience stuff isn't local. So, you know, one thing we've talked about in past meetings, but I will just throw out there again, is some kind of more formal engagement with the MPOs. So how do we, you know, I know Caltrans is on all their boards. You know, the Caltrans district directors, is there a role for like an ex officio strategic growth council, you know, position on the boards? I don't know what it is, but some kind of more formalized engagement there so that we actually do have a mechanism to really have those conversations that Nicole was talking about. So those are just some ideas that came to me, but I really would want to echo just the gratitude for the amount of time and thought, and just encourage us to be even more specific and more targeted on, given all the things happening, given I think that this administration and the governor in particular is very integrated in his thinking, and we're getting more integrated. There are all these different pieces kind of moving toward very specific opportunities. How do we make this be a value add on top of that? And I don't know if that goes to a revision or it goes to, I don't know what that goes to in terms of the today's decision. I don't know if people have ideas on that, but you know, maybe we come back with something a little more specific that responds. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody agrees here on the problem statement and the priority on housing. And we also see that there's maybe a niche or a role that we can play as the SGC that is unique. I think everyone is also, I'll just say that the breadth and complexity of the housing challenge is daunting. And there are a lot of smart leaders already focused on this. So I think role definition or purpose of this effort, you know, and being clear about that is essential. I, for one, would consider it a slam dunk success if by the fall you were able to help identify for each agency up here what are the 5 things we can do within our own statutory authorities, administrative authorities, to facilitate appropriate housing. And if you were to, we were able, SGC project, were able to help us understand, and where do we work, where specifically can we work together to further facilitate that appropriate housing? So then to me, it's sort of like, what are the barriers that agencies are unknowingly putting up to appropriate housing, or what are the opportunities that we're not seizing? You know, our agencies probably represent over $100 billion of annual investment, all sorts of programs and tools that maybe we could be using or leveraging to help locals build more housing, et cetera. I do think we have to learn from, I mean, this is, you know, this problem gets solved between the state and the local level, or maybe even just at the local level first. So in this effort, if we're going to be agency-centric or focused around what we can do as state agencies, it has to be from learning from the local. So I'd still say there needs to be, you know, heavy interaction. I just don't want to try to take on or suggest we should take on the whole enchilada because I don't think we have the authority to do so, and there are others working on it. So Nicole brought up, for example, that there's going to be a lot of focused legislative discussion on that, which is critical. It seems like law changes are essential, but I don't think we should get in the middle of that, or I don't even think we have a role necessarily to play within those legislative conversations. Or if we do, it should be very well defined. So I just want to echo, I think my sense of the council is everybody's excited about this, but wants more specificity to really understand where we can add value.
I guess my only response would be, I think it should be housing and transportation. Because one of the problems in San Diego and Orange County, because my organization works in both, we don't have enough of transit. So then you think, well, if we have to put housing near transit, we don't have transit, then we just deal with the sprawl problem. I mean, so I'm just saying we also need critically as critically important are investments in transit and active transportation, which we do. So I don't this is totally within our realm. So anyhow, that's just something I feel. And then as far as the legislature is concerned, I'm not saying we get in the mix of any legislative conversations. I'm saying you bring them into the conversation. Again, this is new. I don't know exact mechanics, but you want to be on the same page with how they're thinking, and you want them to get buy-in to the administration's vision and where some of the state dollars are going. So it's more that than getting in the mix. I'm not suggesting that. Just again, trying to get the right stakeholders to the table. So anyhow, that's what I was trying to say.
Wade, I was going to say, I think that's a really good point. Thank you for reminding me of that. Your point is not us to intervene in the legislative process, but to help legislators understand what we're doing and play a role so that they can ultimately, hopefully, support our efforts, but then also leverage our efforts. But I do think on transportation, I mean, I think absolutely, in order to create appropriate housing, we need effective transportation investments. But I will say, as it relates to these principles, we also need other things, right? So I would say, maybe we identify, as it relates to, what our agencies can do, that our transportation agency, we need to support our transportation agency in scaling up, regional transportation investments. But likewise, for example, our agency, maybe we need to do a better job enabling habitat conservation plans and natural community conservation plans, which allow for master planning to protect open space and habitat to be more effective. So the idea is, if we say, the goal is building more appropriate housing, and then we identify, okay, well, what do each of us need to do? What are the priorities, et cetera? I just don't want to get into a situation where we're saying, in my mind anyway, where we, are. I would want to stay focused on that golden ring of appropriate housing, and then identifying what's needed to enable that.
Well, and it sort of goes to what we mean by appropriate, right? So it's. I think the point is really well taken, and it's also, just from a VMT perspective, it's also, as GoBiz is always reminding us, it's not just housing near jobs, it's jobs near housing. So there's a lot of housing that's already been built all over the state, and to what extent can we help those people not have to still drive 3 hours to get somewhere? It's not new, but it's their communities are already in places where there's a lack of economic development, which is another issue. So all these things are coming together in kind of one place, which seems really important. And how do we think? I mean, it's an interesting question. Do you focus in on the benefit of focusing on the housing piece is a huge priority for the governor and for the administration, and it's a focusing mechanism. But maybe thinking about what that means, what it means in terms of the other co-benefits is important. Alexis, did you want to?
Yeah, I think just to sort of tie together what Wade has suggested, I mean, yes, we have a lot of people working on the housing issues, right, and homelessness issues, and that goes across departments and agencies already. But I do think that even just having the dialogue of where the barriers exist and what we know but maybe haven't had the hour meeting scheduled to share would really maybe help us connect dots that aren't yet connected. And none of these issues stand alone as problems. They really are all intertwined, which I think has already been said a number of times. So yeah, it's just, what lens are you looking at them through, right? Is it housing? Is it climate change? Is it transportation? Is it health? I mean, is it ag? I mean, it's just local government. I mean, you could look at tackle all these issues through any one of those lenses, and maybe that happens over the coming years. But I do think, given how woefully inadequate our housing supply is for our population, it's appropriate that the governor has made this a big priority, and I think it's appropriate for the council to have taken this on as its first sort of work plan focus.
I mean, I am the first person to think everything is related to everything, as you all know, but I would argue also, I think housing has the benefit of being, just back to the timescale issue, the benefit of being place-based and specific, and there are numbers and there are goals, and it is our state economists just downgraded our population projections from 50 million by 2050 to 45 million by 2050, in large part because of affordability and people leaving the state. And it is a growth issue specifically. So I'd almost argue, you take climate change or health and you get everything. You get massive timescales and massive things, and sort of that focusing in on a fairly specific place-based set of things that's in that short-term time horizon does make sense, but with the caveat that it's all related. You can't do housing without transportation if you care about VMT, which is, again, the appropriate housing issue.
Right. And I guess I would just to be the devil's advocate, because once again, SB 375 was, a centerpiece was VMT reduction. The Sustainable Community Strategy is all about VMT. So you can't just build housing and give VMT reduction. That's all. So don't worry. I'm just like.
The other way to go about it, and Louise brought this up at an earlier meeting, is to make the whole thing about VMT instead of about housing. So that's just, it's not a crazy idea.
Well, I'm heartened to see this conversation because we all had this conversation many times. Is it just about housing? And I think, and we went around and around on it as well. And I think partly because there are so many people working on housing, one thing we don't want to appear is that I think what we want is to think about how we put that conversation, maybe to your point, Wade, in the context of these broader issues of growth. And I think and I recognize that becomes more nebulous, and there's a little bit of a leap of faith of what is that going to look like. But I don't know that we know, because we haven't tried to do that as a state. We have been tackling these things somewhat, individually. And so what does it look like to bring it together? And I think we can, I think we all probably have ideas. And I would say, I'm hesitant to publicly say we need to do X, Y, or Z right now. But I think we know where there are some near-term connections that we can be making in more productive ways, or just daylighting some of them. And I think to your point, think about how you do conservation to support housing. That's probably not a way that we've thought about conservation, but it would be a really interesting exercise. And how does that look with how it's currently happening? And I think that's what's happening with transportation and the Transportation Housing Work Group is, how do we do transportation to support housing? And how do we start embedding, integrating those two disciplines, if you will, or sectors? And so I think those are the conversations we have to understand what this is going to look like. And I would say, I think, and I should have said this earlier, I do think a unique value that SGC brings is all of the work we've done at the local level, and whether it's on technical assistance and capacity building, project development, project pipeline development, we have those relationships as well to bring up into that conversation. But we went around and around on this issue too. This was all about housing. This was about housing and transportation. So now we've made it about growth. But it is a challenge. We went around and around on this, and I will just say, I don't know that I have the right answer on where we want to land, but I think this is a really helpful conversation for us to think about, and happy to go back and rework it and try to come up with a very, and I think if we undertake a bit of a mapping exercise between now and April, we can start to daylight some more specifics.
Thanks, Louise. And I think maybe and maybe this is just a reading thing, but under the priorities, I think one of the maybe sources of not confusion, but could be clearer, is that the first one is they're separated from each other in the principle. So housing is the first one, and then natural working lands, and then mobility, and so they're separated. So when the first one is about housing and its increased housing supply and support other development, that's the key part of that statement. And so it appears that that's not about transportation and natural working lands and all the things, the appropriate word that Wade was using. Mm-hmm. Maybe there's a way to have that overarching thing that actually integrates those into the idea of what we mean by housing. Like, what do we mean by sustainable growth, strategic growth? What does that actually mean? And then all of us committing to that from a housing perspective, and then that becomes that integrates those ideas instead of having them separated out. It's just a thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the way I would say that is, look, our policymakers' priority this year is more housing. And we want to contribute to that, but we also, because we're the SGC, want to make sure it's the right kind of housing. And so our focus will be what are the roles our agencies can play to support housing creation, but support sort of smart growth housing creation. And so we would then, it would be able to us to elevate VMT, for example, and the fact that no, not all housing is created equal. And part of what we're doing is ensuring that our agencies are working to shape, to the extent possible, the state's growth to address these other principles. You know what I mean?
I do. This is one of those, it's like, it's too bad that Jared isn't here because he loves strategic planning, but it reminds me of those conversations you always have where you have the mission statement and then you have the strategies underneath it. And to me, these principles are the strategies, but there's lacking that thing. Like, what is the thing at the top of them? What is the thing we're all trying to achieve? And then these are the priorities we have in order to achieve that. So I feel like that's because you want everything you do to kind of make sure it fits within that mission. And you could come up with a lot of things that fit in different of these priorities, but don't fit necessarily the other ones. So how do we integrate them? I don't know if that makes sense.
Kate's comment just reminded me of that, like, goal, objective, strategy.
Yeah, exactly.
Or like goal, strategy, tactic. I've heard,
Goal, strategy, tactic.
Yeah, that kind of method of breaking down into actions.
Get Saul Alinsky up here now. We're doing the organizing thing. Mike.
And not to keep this going round and round, but the public health here, number 5 line item, we just haven't talked too much about it. And I know that resonates at the local level when you talk greenhouse gas reduction, when you talk carbon footprint, people start glazing over. But public officials at the local level take it personal when you talk about public health. We view that as it's always one of the top parts of our mission statements, and equity also. And I think, I don't know, to me it folds under the public health as to why are we doing this? Why more housing? I get that it's a shortage, but why do we need it? And why reduce vehicle miles traveled? And it gets down to, and living in Southern California and in Southeast Los Angeles where air quality is particularly bad, all of these things impact air quality, which is impacting our public health. So, and that's just a shout out to public health. But
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important, that's also a timescale point to some extent. We have the same issue with VMT. When we go out and talk about VMT, we don't talk about why it's important from a reducing GHG emissions in the future and why that matters, even though we're 1% of global emissions. Like, that goes down a whole rabbit hole. We really talk about health and quality of life and safety and, land preservation, like all the things people think about on a daily basis.
The timescale thing is so true. So our portion of Southeast Los Angeles was just crop dusted by Delta Airlines when they did a fuel dump on the way in. And on the forefront of our mind for the last month has been nothing but air quality, and it changes everything, and it will stay changed for probably the rest of this year. The new focus from housing and homelessness, which has been a key focus, to now air quality, and people are waking up to all the other things that are impacting air quality. And so, like you were saying, you need to seize that moment to then take advantage of that to lift up your other air quality concerns in this portion of California. But it's not going away.
You want to,
I just realized that I didn't really say this explicitly because I feel like everybody at the table is, and in the room is already thinking this way. But yeah, we absolutely have we have the receipts. We have the scientific studies that show that housing, transportation have measurable, concrete outcomes on the public health and personal outcomes. So I think this is a tremendous step in that direction. And I do think you're right that at a local level, granted, I'm coming from the HHS agency, so please forgive it if it sounds like a plug for this, but I think at a local level, sometimes talking about people's health really opens up the conversation and makes it apolitical in a way that sometimes we can't do if we're talking about climate change, where people just get kind of set in, get a little dug in sometimes. So I think message-wise, sometimes that can be a really important way in.
I would just add, I think there's a real imperative to take this back to the SGC team, staff team, and really work to flesh this out based on the feedback you've heard from the council, and then maybe come back to that in that April meeting and share in advance, obviously, so that we all have confidence in sort of leaning into this, that we are very clear and focused in what we're doing, and we all or have confidence that there'll be direct outcomes that we can help enact.
So I think what I'm hearing up here is a desire. It's an interesting question whether that we can figure out a recommended action that works with this. I mean, I think there's a general feeling that the priorities are really good and important, but a desire to kind of have you go with staff go back and really think about how do we translate those into something that clearly gets at role of SGC, the sort of outcome, the integrated approach, the measurable outcomes pieces. Do you want us to take an action to approve the priorities, or think about that? What's a way forward here from your perspective?
I mean, this is all very helpful feedback. I mean, I think if we feel like the priorities for us seemed like a really important starting point because it gave us something to kind of ground what we're doing in. But I think if we still want to think about how they feed up into something bigger, we can just sort of take this conversation to let us know we're headed in the right direction and go from there. And, I don't know that we have to take a formal action. We can just sort of take all of this feedback and bring it back.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're hearing is, and just correct me if I'm wrong, but a definite, I think everybody wants there to be a work plan and feels really good about the direction and about the priorities generally, wants to see, again, a little more specificity from what you heard. So I think that's probably the right approach, is to come back in April with something that's a little bit more fleshed out, and obviously the key staff will work on that with you, that we can look at and think about, and maybe even including some examples of sort of how this would play out, as Wade was really talking about in terms of sort of agency inadvertent barriers that are being created, or sort of, what are some areas across our agencies that would feed in to these priorities and that we could be thinking about going forward. I think that'd be really helpful. Does that make sense to you? Anyone want to amend that, or any concerns about that approach? Okay, well, thank you. It's great discussion too, everybody. Thank you. It's really, really important. We need to figure this out.
Any public?
I didn't get any cards for public comment, so I didn't, I encourage people to come back in April with comments on this, because we want to hear from all of you. And I think that is the last item on our agenda. So with that, and again, thank you for everybody. Again, Alexis, thank you for your service to the state for so many years, and to the Strategic Growth Council. We really appreciate it. And with that, we will adjourn. Thanks, everybody.